And welcome everyone to our April Potpourri meeting. For those who don't know me, I'm Randy, the host tonight, Randy Atwood, and hopefully within a few months we will be able to do this face-to-face. There are hints from the university that non-students and non-faculty will be allowed back on the campus. As early as May. I haven't heard anything about our May meetings yet, but we're all hoping that we can get back on campus. So we have a full agenda tonight, 3 speakers, and normally what we do is we ask people to put their questions into the chat during the meeting, and then after the speaker, we'll just go through the chat with the questions. And if everyone is muted, except for our speaker, of course, I will ask the Mississauga Centres Light Pollution Abatement Committee Chair, Keith Jarvie, to say a few words about the committee, because it's sort of been revitalized lately, and then to introduce our speaker. Keith?
Thanks, Randy. I thought that I'd try to put my own experience with light pollution abatement into a little bit of a context. I actually joined the center in 2006, and I was looking back some old emails, and it was rather remarkable to remember that far back. Time really has gone by very quickly. It was in 2007 that I first reached out to, at that time, Professor Robert Dick, who is the head of the RASC's National Light Pollution Abatement Committee. And I wanted to share with him my first attempt at advocacy for dark skies. I'd actually contacted the Ministry of the Environment because I'd gotten so sick and tired of the amount of light that was coming off the 400 series highways. I learned that if you talk to the wrong ministry, you won't get very far. They told me, no, that's the Ministry of Transport, not the Ministry of the Environment. A bit of a swing and a miss on my part, and a little bit of an introduction, I guess, to how to work with the government. For the good and the bad of it, I guess I've been in the government now working there for over a decade, and hopefully some of that experience can be brought to bear in terms of some of the advocacy work that we may hope to do in the future. Robert provided me with a great example at that time of Highway 416 near Ottawa, where the highway was in the vicinity of the protected lands of the National Capital Commission. And in that instance, because the high mast reflectors, they actually had shields installed onto them to limit the egress of light beyond the highway. And he offered, rather simplistically but eloquently, the solution was a part number away. And I thought that was a great way of looking at, sometimes you can make a great difference, at least in the case of light pollution abatement, with relatively small changes or small improvements. I've seen a similar accommodation made up on the Bruce Peninsula in Lions Head. The Blue Water Astronomical Society there holds some really nice public outreach events, and they hold them adjacent to the water, which is adjacent to the marina, which is adjacent to a parking lot. And again, they've got a large light standard there. And if you look up at that light standard, you can see how they've actually gone out of their way to put a shroud over top of it that allows full illumination of the parking lot, but not of the place where people are over by the water side. And it still allows you, even though you're within 200 feet of a fairly bright street light, you can still see the Milky Way overhead, which is really a great thing. And obviously, if you want to talk about the glory of the night sky, it helps to be able to actually point at it. As for the activities of our own center, I'd like to say we're getting an excellent start with the presentation which Victoria will be giving this evening. But beyond that, there's a lot of space for us to determine what sorts of activities we want to undertake. As Randy mentioned, we haven't been particularly active in light pollution abatement, even though it's something that I think we're all very sensitive to. Those activities might be things we'll do as a center on our own, or certainly in coordination and with the participation of the National Committee. There's lots of aspects to consider here, the most obvious being, of course, light egress, how we light our homes, businesses, lighting in our own communities. But there's more of that. There's things like dark sky sites, which the national office has been very active in promoting. There are things, as Randy had mentioned about prior to this, in terms of just making sure that the dark sky sites we have stay dark. And maybe looking at ways we can try to find out, for those of us who have to travel 1, 2, or maybe 3 hours to go to dark sky sites, are there things we can do within those communities that make it easier for us to stay over there so we can enjoy the dark nights and still make it back safely home? This topic remains absolutely contemporary. I was a little late getting my mailbox today, but Sky News The most recent edition out is actually rife with some really nice articles on the importance of dark skies. There's a really wonderful personal reflection in there by Nicole Mortellero on her first and second experience with dark skies and the effect on nature, birds in particular. So again, some really solid writing in the latest Sky News that if you haven't seen it, I recommend you get to it as soon as you can, because it's really going to be, you're really going to enjoy it. With that, it's my extreme pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce our special guests for this Potpourri meeting, Dr. Victoria Kramkowski. Victoria is a professional in the fields of environmental planning and climate change, with a focus on working with various governmental sectors, including provincial, municipal, and other government agencies. Most recently, this work is extended to protecting and rewilding the night sky, and Victoria is a member of the RASC National Light Pollution Abatement Committee, where she's developing a toolkit for RASC members to advocate for night sky protections. Victoria's worked in academia, independent consulting, and the public sector, and her current role is in government relations for Conservation Authority, working with and advocating to various levels of government, as well as private landowners, community groups, and other organizations and agencies in order to move forward environmental protection projects. Victoria has a PhD in environmental planning from York University and is also a member of the RASC National Science Committee and the RASC Toronto Centre. We had a chance to speak. It was a chat that went for an hour, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. She is exceedingly articulate, and her passion and knowledge of the subject, I think, will come through very clearly in her presentation. And with that, it's my extreme pleasure to open the floor to Victoria, please.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And thank you all for having me here today. I hope I get to live up to that compliment, Keith. And yes, I am a little chatty once you get me going. So I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see that? Can I get maybe a thumbs up if you see that?
Looks fine.
So just to provide a little bit more background on myself, as Keith mentioned, you know, my expertise is really in the environmental sector and in government relations. And I'm a bit of a baby when it comes to RASC. I'm a newer member, but I was really immediately drawn to more meaningful participation in the organization, and the Light Pollution Abatement Committee was really a natural fit for me because light, like many other phenomenon, when used improperly, is a source of pollution that really impacts how we experience the natural world and impacts the natural world. So this is something that I was really excited to start to take part in. And I'm going to show you a little bit about what the National Light Pollution Abatement Committee is doing and what we have on the horizon as well too. So first off, what is the purpose of RASC's National Light Pollution Abatement Committee? So we are, our purpose is to coordinate RASC's efforts to raise awareness of light pollution and to try to mitigate the detrimental effects of it. Not just for astronomical and observing purposes, but also the negative impacts that it has on human health, on the environment, and the night sky overall. We do maintain an online database of light pollution initiatives across Canada. We're also the RASC liaison for the International Dark Sky Association too, and other light pollution groups. Something that I'll speak about in more detail is our Dark Sky Site program. And so we administer that. We have 26 different dark sky sites across Canada, and we have more in the hopper that we're working with. We also we have members that conduct research on light pollution effects and also on mitigation methods. And we also work to encourage sharing of different strategies and techniques and learnings, both amongst different centers, but also to members of the public, companies, municipalities, as they adopt measures to try to mitigate light pollution. So who is the Light Pollution Abatement Committee? So Bob King is our chair. We also have members, Roland Shane, we have Peter Brackett, who is here today, Chris Wiedek, we have myself, we have Lauren Knowles, who is a RASC national staff person and has been an amazing resource and really knows her stuff. I've worked with her for a little bit now since I've been on the committee, and she's really helped, I think, to elevate our work. Phil Groff is also on the committee, as is Robin too. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but just so that we're all on the same page, the basics about what light pollution is. And light pollution is the inappropriate or excessive use of artificial light and its associated adverse effects. So there are different types of light pollution. Many of you will be familiar with glare, which is excessive light that reduces visibility. So sometimes if you're driving at night, maybe it's a little misty. I have a lot of issues with glare from street lights that are too brightly lit. And it really, while the intent is for safety and to help to facilitate safe driving, it actually sometimes does the opposite. We're all familiar with sky glow, which is the overall brightening of the night sky over inhabited areas like the GTA, which we're all very familiar with. Light trespass is where light falls where it's unintended or unnecessary, often intruding on other properties and sometimes causing neighborly disputes as well too. And clutter is a collection of multiple bright or confusing or excessive groupings of different light sources that also can cause safety issues when traversing at night. So why should we care about light pollution? Obviously, we all care because we love the night sky. We love to observe the night sky. And the more light pollution we have, the more that interferes with what we love to do. But I think it's important to remember that there are so many different audiences out there that maybe are not so familiar with light pollution, but are still impacted by it, even if they're not necessarily aware of it, or the things that they love are impacted by it. So light pollution can have negative impacts on humans. We are all subject to our natural circadian rhythm, which much of life is required for much of life. And in humans in particular, when we experience darkness, that releases melatonin. Some of us will take melatonin sometimes when we have difficulty sleeping, and melatonin is really critical for us to experience proper sleep. Now, by having artificial light at night, both outside our homes, but also within our homes as well too, so things like TV or even having the lights on at night, there are increased health risks. You see this particularly, there's a lot of studies of people who work night shifts and have really disrupted circadian rhythm, where they have increased chances of developing various different cancers, diabetes, obesity, and mood disorders as well. And I think even for those of us who don't work shift work, we all know that when we have disrupted sleep cycles, certainly that impacts us, how we feel physically and mood-wise as well. Most of the time, you'll see excessive light at night in the intention of increasing safety. But this does not always work. So in fact, having inappropriate light or over-illumination can actually sometimes result in decreased safety. So I love these two photos here because it really shows how, on the left, you have a backyard, you have a glaring wall light, and when you cover the glare from that light, you can see that in fact there is somebody who is standing there in the backyard, maybe where you're going to be walking, but is not so apparent when you have that glare from the light. This speaks to something that increasingly is being used by often police departments. I know Peel Police does this as well too, which is, short form is called CPTED, which is Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. And this is an approach that's used to try to plan sites or neighborhoods so that they're safer. And the idea is, and what's being increasingly recognized, is that having more light is not always the safer thing. Light doesn't help if you have an area where there aren't eyes on it at night. Sometimes light can actually reduce the eyes on an area at night. So for example, there was a study in the United States where in a low-income neighborhood, there was more lights, very bright lights, put in the neighborhood in an effort to reduce crime prevention. And in fact, or to reduce crime. And in fact, crime actually went up because many people, because there was so much light coming into people's windows at night, they actually closed the curtains so that you had less eyes on the street and less people to interrupt crimes in progress. But something else too that is really important to note is that the night sky has a millennia of cultural heritage for all sorts of groups and all sorts of cultural groups across the globe. There are indigenous groups in particular have a very close connection with the night sky. The night sky is associated with stories. For some groups, night sky is associated with navigation. And so there are many indigenous groups that are starting to state that light pollution is actually a form of colonization, that it's disconnecting them from their culture and the ties that they have with the night sky. And of course, for all of us, the night sky is important both for what we enjoy doing, but also for the connections that we have, the things that make us, the way the night sky makes us ponder bigger questions and makes us feel part of something larger. Now, getting to other species beyond humans, light pollution also impacts animals and plants. So for those of you who are interested in the ecosystem surrounding you, light pollution at night can change nesting behaviors for birds. They can impact mating rituals. They can upset the balance of predator-prey relationships. They also disrupt the navigation of not just nocturnal creatures, but creatures that sometimes migrate at night, but that we normally associate with the day. So sea turtles are one such creature where when they hatch at night, they tend to move towards what the brightest light is, which normally is the moon on the sea. But now ecologists are finding that they're actually moving towards cities and streets because that's where the brightest light is. But for us, less sea turtles here in Ontario, but we do have many migratory birds. And so some of you might be familiar with some of the organizations like FLAP that work with migratory birds and try to mitigate some of the impacts of light at night. And I'll get into that in a bit more detail in a moment. But light at night also can attract birds and insects, which leads to collisions, can lead to increased predation, and really just generally upsets the ecological balance of these different competing species at night. I think somebody might be unmuted. Thank you. So just to talk about something a bit more local. Songbirds, for those of you who maybe are birders as well, I do find that sometimes astronomers tend to have a correlation with being birders too. Many birds migrate at night for a variety of different reasons: cooler temperatures, denser air, which leads to less turbulence, avoiding predators. Some even, there have been studies that find that some actually navigate using stars. But in general, birds are drawn to light at night and are particularly confused by it. So here on the right, you can see sort of two images, and one are trees at dusk. So you can see the, sort of the pale light shining through, and then you also see very similar picture of a building lit up at night. So there are thousands of bird collisions on a very regular basis. In Toronto alone, over 1 million birds are killed by colliding with buildings. Some of this is during the day, but much of it is also at night. And there's a variety of different organizations. I had mentioned FLAP, which is stands for Fatal Light Awareness Program, that try to raise awareness of measures that building owners can take, such as shutting off the lights at night, installing bird-friendly glass to try to mitigate some of this. Now, something that the National LPA Committee is really focused on is our dark sky site program. And this program recognizes sites not just that contribute to the reduction of light pollution, but also that celebrate the night sky. So these often include education for the public about dark skies, and these sites will also work with nearby municipalities to try to improve their lighting measures, both for the benefit of their communities, but also for the benefit of the dark sky site. And we're working to expand Canada's network of these dark sky sites, both to protect the nocturnal environment and nocturnal ecosystems, but also to create more opportunities for members of the public to enjoy a night sky. So there are a few different types, 3 different types of dark sky sites. Urban star parks are, as the name implies, located in more urban areas. They tend to be brighter than the other types of dark sky sites that we have due to their location, but artificial lighting is strictly controlled within the park in order for them to qualify. They have to have easy public access. So there's a lot, while perhaps the sky might be brighter than at some of our other dark sky sites, there's also a lot more opportunity for members of the public to access these sites. Public education programs are a key part of qualifying to be an urban star park. And these relate to the night sky, to the nocturnal environment, and to why they're undertaking light pollution abatement in general. And urban star parks, in order to qualify, also conduct outreach with the municipality that they're in or that they're adjacent to as well. Dark sky preserves are usually the darkest of the 3 types of dark sky sites that we have. Again, artificial lighting is limited and strictly controlled within these in order for them to qualify. They have to have public education programs, and there has to be access to the dark sky preserve at night. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little bit further because I know in my discussion with Keith earlier, before we had, while I was preparing for this webinar, that access to these, to potential dark sky sites, or at least sites that might be appropriate for observing at night, sometimes they are a bit restricted at night. And, you know, as somebody who works in the environmental field, I work for an organization that has a lot of green space that's accessed by the public. I understand that, you know, there are sometimes concerns by the operators of these sites about, you know, having people on site at night, how to control that. And I just wanted to say that for dark sky preserves, there are a variety of different options that many of them pursue in order to allow access to those sites at night. So they, you know, it might not necessarily be that the whole preserve is accessible at night. There might be certain sites that are accessible to observers or those who want to enjoy the night environment. There are some setups where, you know, local astronomical clubs or a RASC center will have a key to the site or will have a permit to use it at certain times or at certain days. So there are various different measures that are in place depending on the dark sky preserve and the needs of the operator. But in all cases, there will be public education programs both on the night environment as well as on light pollution abatement and what to expect when you're there. So for example, for areas where you can camp over, there will be signage or brochures about how campers can reduce their light for the enjoyment of everyone. And they also conduct outreach with surrounding municipalities and communities too. Nocturnal preserves are for sites that perhaps are definitely interested in preserving the nocturnal environment, but may not have access to the public at night. So in these cases, again, artificial lighting is limited and strictly controlled, but the primary goal of nocturnal preserves is to protect the nocturnal environment. Some of them do have access at night or perhaps in certain situations, but that primary goal is really just the protection of the nocturnal environment. And similarly, in all cases, they conduct outreach with their surrounding municipalities and do have public education programs for their daytime visitors. So this is a list of the dark sky sites that we currently have across Canada. So some of them you may have visited. I hope maybe it might give you some inspiration for other places to travel this summer or over the course of the year. And like I mentioned, we have various other sites that we're working with that are at various stages of the application process. So when a site approaches us and is interested in potentially becoming a dark sky site, we'll work with them to help to move forward their application, to give them guidance. But if at all possible, we also try to connect them with their closest RASC center to also have maybe additional guidance from them. RASC members are, as I'm discovering, so incredibly knowledgeable and may be able to provide pretty detailed guidance on light pollution abatement measures. But also there are opportunities for local RASC centers to offer some of that programming as well at the site for the public. So a variety of different ways to get involved further. If you say know of a local place that you think might meet dark sky site criteria or that has the potential to, that we could work with, I would encourage you to reach out to us. We can provide guidance in approaching them. We can approach them as well too, and we can work together on that. If you're interested in talking about light pollution in your community, something that we are working on is developing a guide and a toolkit to engage with municipalities and other levels of government as well too, both on implementing light pollution abatement measures like outdoor lighting standards, but also potentially for approaching them to implement dark sky sites. So that toolkit is going to include sort of a general guide on how to approach different levels of government. It will include a model template bylaw. It will include a model template council report, some frequently asked questions that can be provided to elected officials or to municipal staff to make their lives a little bit easier when responding to the public. And a variety of other tools as well too. So that's something that's in the works. And if you're really enthusiastic to take action on light pollution abatement, there's a few different things that we can also help with. So you can document your local circumstances, and that can include photographing examples of, both positive and maybe excessive lighting designs in your area. RASC does have sky quality meters that can be borrowed. I think you've checked off starting your own local LPA committee, but definitely interested and happy to talk further about where there might be opportunities to work together. We also certainly are interested in involvement in the National LPA Committee. Obviously, we need a bit more Ontario representation, so if there is interest, happy to talk about that as well too. And you can always support our committee's work with a donation as well that's used for support for dark sky sites, for travel, for openings, and for other types of materials like brochures as well too that help the dark sky sites get across their message to their audiences. And happy to I'm happy to share my contact information directly afterwards, but you can always reach us at darksky@rasc.ca as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Victoria. We do have time for questions, and there are some questions in the chat. Question from Alan: what is the difference between a dark sky preserve and a nocturne preserve?
So the two main differences: dark sky preserves tend to be there are darker standards for them, but a really major difference is that the dark sky preserves have to have public outreach programs and access at night. So, and again, that can vary. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that the entire preserve is open, to everybody all night, every night, but there has to be provisions in place for access, whereas the nocturnal preserves don't necessarily have access at night. And so really the main purpose of the nocturnal preserves is to preserve that nocturnal environment, but is not necessarily for access to it. Some do have it, but it's not the main criteria, or it's not a main criteria like it is for dark sky preserves.
Okay, thank you. A question from Mark Tovey from the London Centre. And I'm wondering, Mark, if your question is, how do you get in touch with someone at the LPA committee? And I think Victoria mentioned that. If you want to type something into the chat, if I misinterpreted your question, please do so. But yeah, the dark sky at rasc.ca I think is a good way to start.
Yes, yeah. And what I'll also mention is, the National LPA Committee, I'm finding as I'm getting more integrated in it, everybody has very diverse and different areas of expertise as well too. So for example, Roland on our committee has been doing a lot of work and is really interested in light pollution from greenhouses, for example. He's also really interested and has a lot of expertise when it comes to ecological impacts of light pollution, and big focus on songbirds. So each member has different areas of expertise. So depending on maybe what the question is or the area of need, then we can connect you with the right member for that.
Okay, thank you. Question from Rob. Is there any initiative to restrict the sale of certain floodlights and home exterior lighting designs?
So I don't believe we're really focusing on restricting those particular, on advocating for restrictions, but we're really trying to work with communities that are interested to try to shape their standards, their bylaws. In some cases, they're planning bylaws for new communities or for retrofits to try to change those requirements so that the requirements for, say, new communities or retrofitted communities are more in compliance with more positive lighting. So at this point, we're not, and Peter, who I know you're on, please let me know if maybe there have been discussions that maybe predated my involvement. But in general, we're focusing more on trying to encourage municipalities to implement measures that help that will create some restrictions, but not necessarily restricting the sale of those types of lights.
Victoria, I can comment on that a little bit.
Yes, please.
One of our big focus is trying to get them moved away in the community, street lights, wherever they're doing it, from the bright blue spectrum lights to more amber. And you can get into the technical terms, but under 3,000 Kelvin, or they're moving down to 2,500, 28. So basically, we're trying to encourage them to move to these amber lights, which don't trigger the same effects as the bright blue high intensity lights do. And there's been lots of work being done on that. we're doing work with the greenhouses to reduce the output from the greenhouses at night, especially down in the Leamington area, that there's tremendous activity going on there. But many of our members have been very active in lobbying the municipal governments. We had a very active program in Calgary when a major road was going in to try and reduce the intensity and the light coloring that they were using. So we've never tried to ban anything, but we've tried to use education to make people realize what is the better solutions and opportunities. Back to you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. We have time for one more question. Is there another question from our observers?
Keith had a question.
Yeah, I was going to mention that we could maybe talk to Dr. Kramkowski about that offline, but it's a good question.
You'll have to tell me what the question is after. I haven't been monitoring the chat.
No.
So.
It's just, well, we used to have access to the Forks of the Credit Provincial Park after hours on weekends or whenever, and it was fine. We'd go in and observe there, and you could actually see the Milky Way from there. During COVID, the gate is locked at sundown, and we've sort of tried to talk to them and ask them why and how long is this going to go on for, and we aren't getting any reaction. So maybe we're just asking offline.
We can talk about that offline.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, this is great. This is a great way to start. Oh, quick question. The Peterborough Astronomical Association has always been very active in LPA. Have you talked to them at all? Do you reach out to non-RASC centers, other astronomy clubs? Or have they reached out to you? Or
so I myself, again, as a newer member, I haven't spoken to non-RASC astronomy clubs. Peter, you could probably speak to it a little bit more, but I would certainly say that I think any local astronomy club where there's there's interest in working together and maybe identifying dark sky sites, we would be certainly happy to talk. But Peter, you might be able to speak a little more to maybe other astronomy clubs that we've worked with in the past.
It's mainly through the RASC organization that we've been working, and we're trying to encourage the local participation to win the Light Pollution Committee for specific activities. There's a lot of questions, and we have to be careful of the resources so that we can focus on the key things.
yeah, no, I understand. Mark Toby, you got your hand up. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I've got it in the chat, but I can just maybe ask this by audio. Are there lighting resources or catalogs or those kinds of things that you could point us to which would assist municipalities or museums or heritage buildings, catalogs which supply lighting fixtures which are both heritage appropriate and full cutoff?
So that I'm going to ask Peter again if he knows that one. But that's an excellent question. I would be curious. I would want to know the answer to that one. Peter?
Two of our key LPA members was Robert Dick and Richard Husseck, and they've just backed off to be a little farther away. But they were resources that we went to when people were trying to get information. And Robert himself was very involved in the LED lighting committees and companies. So he had a lot of information. So we do have information we can source and make available. There's so much information out there, and we'd be glad to help out with that if anybody wants to send a message to us.
And I would be interested in that as well too, because just as an aside, we had a discussion recently with a gentleman in I think he was in Kitchener, and on their particular street, they used to be gas street lights, but they were retrofitted and made electric. And I think the city was looking to remove them and put in more standard street lights. So there were concerns about light pollution. There was a woodland nearby, and they were concerned about light trespass as well too on properties. but I know there were some potential options that might still give that same feel, and that might still preserve the neighborhood character as well too. So I'll put my email into the chat, and you can get in touch with me, and Peter and I can work to maybe get you with the right person.
Great.
We're definitely glad to work with anybody.
Oh, you're so helpful. All right, Victoria, thank you very much. This was excellent, and maybe I'll make a note to Mississauga Center members that if you're interested in helping out on the committee, then please let Keith know, and I'm sure he would like to build up the team. So thanks again, and this has all been very informative.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Okay, we're going to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Randall Rosenfeld, and Randall is, many of you know Randall. He's been active in the society for quite a while, and he has been the archivist I should say, for the society for many years, chair of the history committee, and lately he has taken over as director of our new telescope museum. And today Randall is going to tell us about the experience, which is 2 years on now and running. And the title of the talk is Building a Museum in a Time of Plague. So this obviously from the 1600s or maybe even today, who knows? So we'll have to listen to Randall. And Randall, thank you for agreeing to give us the background on the developments of the museum.
My pleasure. I'm going to begin, well, before I begin, I have a question, and that is, two questions. Can you hear me? And can you see my slide deck?
Yes to both.
Good. So I will begin. Start by thanking Randy and the Mississauga Center for the invitation to talk about this museum. And that's what I will do now. There are two, give one warning. There's recorded audio and recorded video, and we'll see if they work when they come up. Otherwise, it'll have to be finger puppets. Best place to start is with the person who founded the museum, and that's Rudolph Dorner, who passed away recently. He was a larger-than-life character. He's been a RASC member since the 1960s, and he was very generous to other amateur astronomers in a way which I can say was legendary. I'll give you two examples. Well, this is two examples beside actually funding the Dorner Telescope Museum. Twice he paid for groups of RASC members in the KW Center to go down and use the Great Refractor at Lowell Observatory. So he paid for the rental. He paid, as far as I know, he paid for the room and board and the flights and everything. He was that sort of person. On the right there is a nearly epigraphic quote from him. Telescopes and binoculars are magic, bringing distant astronomical objects close or showing things invisible to the naked eye. That magic has never worn off. And when saying that, he was thinking back to his experience as a young amateur astronomer. His parents buy him a 2.4-inch or 60-millimeter refractor. He turns on this bright object in the heavens, and what does he see? Saturn. And he does a dance. You know, it's just a wonderful thing. He got hooked for life, and the import of that experience never wore off. Now, what I'm going to try to do, if I can bring it up here. Oh, I don't seem to be able to. Oh, there it is. This is a recording. This is the introduction Randy and I had to Rudolph and the Dorner Telescope Museum.
if you're playing audio, it's not being heard. When you share your screen, you need to share audio.
Okay. So let's see here. I can't quite see the, I can't see the instructions for that, actually.
Okay.
Where would they
when
be?
you what the best thing to do is to stop share.
Okay.
And then start share. There should be a button in the start share that also is share audio.
So share screen. I have a green button, share screen. I'll push that.
And share audio as well.
Yeah, that button. So on the row of buttons on the lower left, all I've got is share screen.
Okay, on where you have share screen, you're about to choose your screen. On
Yep.
the extreme left-hand side,
Got
says
it.
Share sound.
And I'm also going to hit optimize for video clip. Let's try this again.
I look forward to hearing from you soonest. Bye.
And I'll just turn that back to the beginning.
Good morning, Randy. My name is Rudolph Dorner. I'm from the KW Center. I've been a member since the 60s. Okay. I've got a couple of $1 million spare, and I would like to establish a somewhat better museum of telescopes than you currently have. And I'm willing to fund this substantially. So I would very much appreciate if you would call me back. Thank you very much, Mr. Atwood. I look forward to hearing from you soonest. Bye.
Did that come through this time?
Yep, we heard it loud and clear.
Oh, good, good. So that's Rudolph, and you get some idea of what his voice was like. That was the first contact we had with him. I'd never heard of him. I don't think Randy had heard of him, and that's how it all started. Oops.
Good morning, Randy. My name is
Second
Rudolph
here.
Dorner.
So, you may be wondering, what is the mission of the Dorner Telescope Museum? And it's simple. It's to tell the story of the telescope in Canada, people, instruments, practices, to unlocking the potential of glass with a story. Well, that seems straightforward enough. So he did elaborate on his vision. Purpose: define, preserve, research, display, and tell the human story of telescopes in Canada. And what Rudolph emphasized to both Randy and me when we went to visit him was that the key factor in building a museum, in public outreach with historical material, is narrative. If you can tell a compelling story, people will enjoy the experience and they'll remember it and it will mean something. It'll be more meaningful for them if you've told them a good story. And it seems intuitive. Attendance. The museum will not gauge its success principally by the number of visitors. True success for the museum will be measured by its ability to research, surface, save, display, and tell the story of Canadian telescopes, their makers, and users. Stories that would otherwise be lost forever. It will also support the continuance of the art of telescope building in Canada. Build it right, that's the museum. Build it right, build a jewel, and you will attract visitors. And he went on to talk about displays. The museum will be artifact rich. So it's almost this Victorian idea of the museum, stuffed cases. Walls of text and images are no replacement for artifacts, and artifacts in abundance. Rare or irreplaceable items will be behind glass, but a core principle of this museum, setting it apart from all others, is that the glass of display cases will be dissolved to the fullest extent possible so that people attending the museum can come face to face with the artifacts. Nothing can replace the tactile experience of putting eye to ocular or reaching out and touching the artifact. It's up to you to figure out how best to do this. And when he said you, he meant me. A lens selection should be available for experimentation. stuff will get broken and stolen. If it happens, replace it. If feasible, consideration should be given to modes of interactive display, allowing visitors to experience the steps in the production of optics. Mistakes will happen, learn from them. Well, it's all good advice. But the hardest challenge of all will be implementing the hands-on aspect for this museum. But it's a good challenge. So the personnel to make this happen. We've got a board of advisors, and we're going to introduce them to you. First one up is Bart Freed. He's the founding president of the Antique Telescope Society, and he's an expert, perhaps the greatest living expert, on RASC honorary member, or I should say former honorary member, Uncle John Brashear, one of the great telescope makers of the 19th and early 20th century. There's Dr. Sarah Schechner, fellow of the American Astronomical Society. She's a David P. Wheatland curator of the collection of historical scientific instruments at Harvard University. There's Roger Serragioli of the University of Arizona's Stewart Observatory Mirror Lab. Robert makes professional optics for professional astronomers for a living. And there's a list there of some of the projects he's had a hand on, including the Great Magellan Telescope, one of the next generation big eyes on the sky. And there's John Briggs of the Astronomical Lyceum in Magdalena, New Mexico. That's an institution, if you're ever in New Mexico or ever in the southern quarter of the States, you should make a point of going to see. And John doesn't look like that. I've never seen him without a smile. So that's an unusual picture. That Marvin the Martian is not on our board of advisors, at least not yet. So some of Canada's finest amateur telescope makers, people like Alan Ward and Peter Pecquerar, they've helped us with expertise and constructive criticism. Again, their contribution is invaluable. But looking ahead, one thing we'll have to plan is who are the personnel who are going to take care of the day-to-day operation of the DTM when it opens. And that's something we're going to have to plan for.
Randall?
Yep.
We're seeing a gray rectangle in the bottom left-hand corner. Are you seeing that?
Bottom left-hand corner.
Where your cursor is?
No.
Oh, okay. I think it. Could you just unshare and share again, and then just restart where you are?
Sure. Stop share. And then share screen.
Yeah, just start again and.
Yeah, all these strange effects.
It's still there, and you did move it earlier. The cursor changes to a moving.
It's
Is
weird.
it moving now?
No, it's down lower, lower, lower. You're going around in circles. Lower, lower. There. That's
What I've okay.
Yeah, right there.
What that is on my screen
Yeah.
is the row of options, buttons for muting.
The zoom options.
Oh, can
Yeah.
you move that out of the way somewhere?
I can try. I've been trying to. How about that? Any better?
Nope, didn't move.
Oh,
there,
is
it's
there-
up at the top now.
Now it's up.
Yes. Is there a way of shrinking it and getting rid of it?
Go, Simon.
It's an artifact of video presentation. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not.
So I hit the
don't
video
know.
thing.
I don't know how to control it.
Well, let's ignore it for now.
Thanks, Simon.
Ask your indulgence.
Right, but just move it out of the way if it's covering something that.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Okay.
It's going to move around the screen, just a warning. So what's been the single biggest factor affecting the progress of the Dorner Telescope Museum over the past 2 years? The same thing that's been affecting everyone else in all of the programs, COVID-19. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. I've been invited down to Arizona by a prominent Canadian amateur astronomer, one known to many of you, to choose whatever I liked for the museum from the instruments in his observatory. And this is an active observatory. I wouldn't walk away with the instruments now, but when he was done with them, I'd get them. That trip was scheduled for what turned out to be the week after the World Health Organization declared the worldwide pandemic. Well, as you can imagine, that trip has been postponed. Next It's generally considered bad form, to say nothing of imprudent and inefficient, to go about trying to reinvent the wheel. In light of that, I thought it might be a good idea to see how a handful of other telescope museums solve the problems of making a museum. So Rudolph planned something grander. A month before he died, he'd begun the preliminary planning for both of us to go on a grand European telescope museum tour to see what worked, what didn't, and what we could steal in the way of ideas for our museum. Well, as you can imagine, that's not going to happen. Next, I was going to start a DTM program of interviewing Canadian amateur telescope makers to preserve the details of their careers in their own words. Well, we got as far as 3 video recordings, and then the pandemic hit. So timelines have changed. The RASC has a new location. Some of you know this. Some of you have even visited it. And there's a picture of it, though not a contemporary picture. Judged by the cards, that's from the 1920s or 1930s. And I wish we had some of those cards now. It'd be great to have the logo of the museum on one of the doors. So the new space has got some definite advantages. One, it's not being knocked down to make room for a condo development. It's bigger than what we had before. It's in a renovated historic building, which is perfect for a museum. It's in a much better location than the previous office. In fact, it's in downtown Toronto, and there's a historic resonance here. From 1905 to 1946, the RASC was located at 198 College. From 56 to 76, it owned 252 College, a building which is still standing. And the space has excellent and abundant natural light. It also has some disadvantages, at least from the standpoint of trying to install a museum. The space is not as big as one might like for the purpose, but spaces never are. Libraries have this problem. There is no storage space for a reserved collection. Gonna have to figure that one out. And there is no space for exhibit preparation, conservation, replication, or certain types of artifact study. Well, no space is perfect, and compromises of one sort or another are inevitable. The space available will have to be used intelligently because we've got no choice. To build a museum, like the Dorner Telescope Museum or any museum, you need a conceptual plan. And we've got one. It's a maximal plan, and there you've got it there, all 11 or 12 pages of it. It's maximal, so that means it'll have to be adapted through reduction while keeping the shape of the narrative intact. And it travels narrative-wise, so it goes forward chronologically from pre-Galileo to the present. All this is made relevant to the practice of astronomy in Canada, chiefly from the standpoint of amateurs, but professionals are also covered there. And I suspect I said it earlier, but I'll say it again. The chief organizing principle is narrative. But within that, so within the subsections, it won't necessarily be following a timeline. You also need a plan. And here's a plan. The principal level of organization is temporal. I've said that several times. So the progression through time, it aids in the comprehension of narrative. The relative areas of the thematic modes are flexible. And on the left there, you've got these thematic modes laid out. Cross-references between the various modes and the artifacts are going to be made in the display labels. The chronological progression provides a suggested path, but of course it's not the only path. People can follow their own path through this, and we're going to suggest some alternative itineraries people can follow. And the image on the right, just let me get this bar out of the way. So the image here on the right shows you the general flow of that primary chronological path. It should be fun in realizing it. Question arises, how should the artifacts be displayed? You could take a general policy that you're going to apply to the whole display and try to be rigorous, or you could adapt the display to whatever the story is that your artifacts for a particular theme want you to tell. So it should be flexible, and that's what we're going to do. So I've got 2 examples here. Upper right, you've got a bunch of Georgian periods, so 18th century or 19th century reflectors. and they're laid out in a row. And I've seen this in some museums. Well, if it's appropriate for what you're doing and your artifacts, if it's a good way to show them, do it. But on the bottom left there, it's more of a, less of a row, more of sort of a cluster. And if that works for your theme, you should follow that. It's almost an intuitive thing. And here's a bunch of our artifacts just laid out. It gives you some idea of the range. Everything from earlier pre-electronic models of the universe, like the upper left there, or the bottom left, early form of a planetarium, to equipment used with telescopes to do astrophysics. So again, the bottom row there, that Roland grating from the late 19th century. Telescopes for the golden age of amateur telescope making, professional instruments from that period. The largest thing here, again, bottom row, third from the right, is a 12-inch f8 telescope. That's the optical tube assembly and not the mount. We've got the mount. It's a big instrument. If you're building, I mean, 12-inch aperture reflector at that time was approaching the largest that any amateur had in their possession. And that thing dates from the 1920s. It's amazing it survives. To its right, so that's second from the left, is a telescope from the late 19th or early 20th century. It's beautifully made. Unfortunately, its primary mirror is missing. We've had that replaced. That's an instrument from the homestead, the farm of Sir Frederick Banting. So it has an association with Canada's first Nobel Prize winner, which is sort of cool. And there's other things in here. There's a 1960s satellite tracking telescope. That's second row, upper right. There are two versions of Newton's, what you might want to call Newton's original reflector. It's actually his third reflector, but it's the one you've seen reproduced. There's a Galileo 17th century display of two of his early refractors and the cracked objective lens, bottom left. But one instrument I really want to concentrate on is the earliest one we're going to have. So in the course of a presentation to the Antique Telescope Society in 2019, this is at the Sunspot Solar Observatory at Sacramento Peak, I asked some basic questions about our knowledge or lack of knowledge of the history of the telescope in Canada. Three of these questions were, when was the earliest astronomical use of a telescope in Canada and where? Does that instrument survive? Well, I had forgotten that Peter Broughton answered several of these questions in 1981, and I should have known better. So the answers are, the earliest known use of a telescope for astronomy in Canada was in 1646 to observe a lunar eclipse. That's 4 years after Galileo died, which to me is amazing. That's moving the history of the telescope, known history of the telescope, back to the founder of its astronomical use. The observer was Father Francesco Giuseppe Bressani, a Jesuit, which sort of makes sense. The place was St. Marie among the Hurons. Again, not a surprise if you've got Jesuits involved. Unfortunately, the instrument doesn't appear to have survived. You can imagine if it did. Bressani sent his observations to Father Athanasius Kircher, another Jesuit, the man who's been described as the last man to know everything. He sent them to Father Giovanni Battista Riccioli, who published them in his Almagestum Novum, the New Almagest, which is like the greatest textbook for doing astronomy of the mid-17th century. And he wrote that Father Bressani observed the eclipse very diligently. So he gave European-wide coverage to this observation made in Canada, and he said it was a good observation. Father Bressani's observations also appeared in Pierre Gassendi's, one of in his collected works, which were published in 1658. And Gassendi was one of the greatest astronomers of this period. And he said that the excellent Bressani, who had observed with an exceptional telescope. Now stand back for a minute. A mere 4 years after Galileo's death, a research quality telescope for the period was harvesting data in the middle of nowhere, that's in Canada, at least viewed through a colonial lens. We need this telescope for the museum, for our museum, but it doesn't survive. So how the hell are we going to get it? Well, we do this. We commission a full working reconstruction of an informed guess of the design of that instrument. It's the next best thing to having the original, with its full documentation, tumble out of a cupboard, which had been sealed up for 375 years. So I tentatively asked one of our a member of our board of advisors, Dr. Roger Serragioli, about the optics. And before I'd finished asking Roger, he said he'd donate the optics to us. Because Roger is also an expert in taking this experimental archaeology of astronomical objects. He finds out as much as we can about how objects are made at a particular period in the past. He gets the tools that were used back then or replicates them, and then makes the optics. So Roger made the optics for us. It's a Campani style objective glass with a Schreilian ocular. It's a compound eyepiece. And then Walter said he's going to ask a friend, Walter Stefani in Kiel, Germany, who's an expert on the Bernhard Schmidt, the man who invented the Schmidt camera and the Schmidt telescope, to see if Walter would help us. Walter immediately said yes, that he would, again using these techniques of experimental archaeology, make us an optical tube assembly using 17th century techniques and a mount and a stand. But for the mount and stand, he'd ask his friend, Dr. Arne Payson, who's an acknowledged expert who works for German museums in making replications. And Arne is also a blacksmith, whether he'd help us. Well, they both agreed to help us. They donate their expertise. All we had to pay for is the materials and the shipping. So you can imagine how happy I was at this. So here's my reconstruction of Father Bersani and the telescope he would have used for that lunar eclipse observation in 1646. And here's the OTA already made with its lens cells. This is a long focal length refractor, and it's a single lens objective. The thing is full size and fully working. And I think on the left, so these views here, these show the objective cell and one of the lenses. I think there are 3 lenses in there for the eyepiece. I mean, not the objective cell, but the ocular cell. And that's the objective cell. And in the middle there are the plans, the architectural blueprints for making this reconstruction, which Walter drew up. On the left there is the chief model we're using, which is from Johannes Hevelius' Cylindrographia, which was published, I think 1647. So almost exactly the right time we're looking for. So that's the model. And on the right there is Arne in his workshop with part of the model. Quite a close replica of the Hevelius image of the stand. Now the next thing I'm going to try to play for you is a video which shows Arne in his forge making some of the iron parts. So with any luck, this will work.
Sehr großartig.
Oops. Oh, there we go. Huh. So it's really cool to have that reconstruction made of the first astronomical telescope, which is also the first research telescope used in Canada, first one we know about. Being a full working reconstruction, that means I can take it, for instance, I can take it to a star party, put on the Mississauga Centre or the London Centre or whatever, and we can set it up with the modern telescopes and people can take a look through it just to compare that view with that through a modern instrument, which to me seems, well, I couldn't think of anything better for using this stuff, these artifacts of astronomy of times past. So here's a list of some of the programs we could follow when the museum is up and running. One, the very top one was Rudolph's idea, and it's Saturn or the moon through 5 centuries of telescopes. So it's a DTM on a road tour. The museum with representative instruments embarks on regional tours to RASC centers. to join them in presenting star parties featuring the experience of stargazing through instruments covering 5 centuries. So that means the museum's got to take 5 of its instruments. This will give RASC members who haven't been to Toronto the DTM experience and provide centers with an enhanced EPO event, Education Public Outreach event. Another program, anytime there's an eclipse, a great comet, or a supernova, which could be seen by the naked eye, yeah, if only, we can look at it through all glass. So along similar lines as the 5 Centuries tour, the DTM can provide the historical dimension of RASC education public outreach efforts during high-profile celestial events, such as a solar eclipse or whatever, by making its instruments available. Obviously, it's going to be at select sites, but still, that's an enhancement. 3, artifact stories. In-depth discovery sessions, unearthing the stories and careers of instruments, their makers and users, with a real hands-on component for participants to experience the materiality of the artifacts and the detective work which goes into making them come alive. So these would be both simultaneous events, in live simultaneous events, and ones going out to electronic audiences through Zoom, YouTube, whatever, where people there in the museum space would get to handle stuff and we talk about it. 4, a register of Canadian telescope makers. This would be freely consultable electronic resource, which would give basic data on Canadian telescope makers, places they lived and worked, dates of activity, what they made, what survives and its location, sources, bibliographic sources, and the influence of these makers and their telescopes. So this would be a tool to help, again, preserve the history of the telescope in Canada. 5, or restart the oral history of Canadian telescope traditions. So interviewing telescope makers who are alive, or people who knew telescope makers who are significant who are no longer alive. Finally, experimental archaeology of astronomy. So it's a program to research and replicate historical observations using the technologies and techniques of the time you're interested in to better understand how data was harvested, to characterize its parameters, and to more accurately characterize the instrument's recording techniques. And at the most basic level, just gain a feel for the experience of the observational art of the past. And I'll end there. That's the mascot of the Dorner Telescope Museum. And he's busy holding a 17th century telescope. So.
Excellent.
Give me a second here. There we go.
All right. Thank you, Randall. And we have some time for questions. Any questions or comments? I think one comment or question was plans to open the facility. How does it look right now?
The big spanner in the works is COVID.
Yeah.
I'm not complaining, but I fall under, what do they call it, most at risk category. And that has severely limited my actually going into the space and trying stuff. So museums are lucky if they could be up and running within a year of when they start. I want to beat that, but it's going to depend on COVID. I'm doing as much planning with pen and paper now to reduce the amount of that has to be done once we can get off, get up and running. I can expand a little bit on that once. Well, so I've got these plans for how the layout is going to work and how stuff's going to be set up. It doesn't matter how much of that planning you do on paper, unless you try it in the space with the actual artifacts. And Mark Tovey could probably second me on this. Unless you try it with the actual artifacts, you don't know if your plan's any good and stuff will work. But after I do that trial testing, and that can be done within a week, then actually getting stuff up and running would be probably quite fast. So this main factor affecting our timing is out of our hands. But tough cookies, gotta live with it.
Okay, well, it'll happen when it happens. I mean, this is this is unique to the society. It's a first, and it's a major first. What can you do? It'll happen when it happens. We're all looking forward to it. Are there any other questions for Randall?
No, Alan's
I have
got
a
something.
question.
Oh, I should
Yeah.
thank Alan, by the way, for helping with the technical things I didn't know.
Well, it was mostly Simon. My
great. Well,
question
thanks.
is for the recreated historical telescope. I assume, would it have been broken into sections that presumably screwed together, or is that just for modern transportation?
No, they did do that with some of them. They had no choice because some of them were so goddamn long, up to 150 or 200 feet. But those often didn't have tubes. Yeah, there were sections, and they didn't use threading to screw them together. They're usually friction fit.
Okay.
So tapering, and my experience with that is that the friction fit works quite well. In fact, sometimes it works so well you end up swearing. But the answer is yes.
But wouldn't the length vary with the friction fit? Sometimes you get a little tighter, or it just affects your focus?
Well, two comments there. There was great depth of field because these things were long focal length, so you could take advantage of that. And I mean, I'll tell you an anecdote. With some of the long ones, like the ones approaching 30 meters in length, you could have more than one person observe through it at the same time. What people would do, this sounds crazy. What they would do, you'd have as many as 5 people. They'd each be holding their own eyepiece, and they could look through the thing standing at different distances at the same time. I know it is ridiculous, but apparently it worked. So it's depth of field, but also, I mean, all you had to do is put a mark with a pencil on what you thought for each of the sections. Push it in this far, and there's an indication that you got, that you got it right. That's a good question, though.
Okay, Matteo is asking where will the museum be located? I think you mentioned at the
It's at the RASC National Office.
Yeah, which is in the College Bathurst area.
So I think 49 College Street.
Yeah. Rob is asking, are you looking for volunteers to get the museum up and running?
Damn right I am.
Okay. What's the best way to, how can we get...
just email me.
Okay.
Is my email hard to find? I suppose I could.
If you put it into the chat, if you're willing to put it in the chat, then people can get it. Or Mississauga Center members can just contact me and I can give you Randall's email very easily. But,
yeah, that'll work. Bother Randy.
Bother me. No, we were in the office last weekend, and big pile of telescopes, and it's looking great. Looking forward to seeing them all set up. Okay, Randall, thank you very much. We'll be following this very closely.
My pleasure.
And our next speaker is actually associated with the museum, Mississauga Center member Kirby Avire, who I guess was a London Center member at some point. Is that right, Kirby?
Yeah, I guess by association.
Okay.
I haven't lived in London for a long time, but I'm kind of a associated member, I guess, with that club.
Okay. Well, Kirby's got a story about a donation of a telescope made just recently, so I'll let him tell us about it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jerry. Can you guys see my presentation full screen and hear my voice okay?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, great. So thanks, Randall. That was a great presentation and overview of the Dorner Telescope Museum. So my piece is going to fit in really well with that, I think. So I've got tonight a historical piece, and you heard Randall mention that one of the objectives that Mr. Dorner had was to try to know the history of every telescope and every artifact that will eventually be in the Dorner Museum. So that we can do. So my story tonight is about 3 telescopes that were built by a London Center RASC member named Donald M. Henniger back in the early 1930s. And we're just going to trace through real quick the history of those telescopes all the way through to the present. And in fact, 2 weeks ago, the largest of those 3 telescopes was donated to the Dorner Museum and will eventually be on display as Randall works through the collection. So we'll just cover a little bit of the early history and the telescope construction and some of his involvement in the London RASC Club. So our story begins with him being born in 1887 in Chicago, moved as a fairly young, as a 3-year-old, I guess, to Canada with his family. He eventually became an architect in the Toronto area, and then moving to London in around 1912 to work for J.M. Moore. And for those of you that know London or know Western's campus, J.M. Moore was the company that was the architect behind the University College that sits on the hill right in the middle of the campus at Western. And so he worked with them for a number of years. In 1932, he branched out on his own architectural practice, and he eventually became the staff architect for the London Life Insurance Company in London. And he was actually the chief designer of their landmark headquarters that's still a landmark in London, Ontario. He was an early member of the London Center RASC. You don't know that he was a founding member, but probably one of the very early members. And they had a lot of their meetings were held at the London Life building, no doubt, because of his connection with that building. He built 3 telescopes in the early 1930s, and that's what I'm going to show you in this presentation. Died in 1951, and yet we still have the telescopes today, and so we'll talk about that story a little bit. So in the late 1920s, he bought 2 books, Lens Work for Amateurs and Amateur Telescope Making. And those 2 originals were passed on to me, and we'll get to that part of the story a little bit later, and I passed them on to the London RASC. So one of their members has those now. These are reproductions that, or reprints that I purchased a bit later. So here's the first one, Amateur Telescope Making. Henniger would have bought the 1928 version, and this is a 1948 reprint. And then the second book that was his primary source of information was a 1931 edition of Lens Work for Amateurs, and I purchased the 1949 version of it. And so he was a pretty capable guy. He had his own mechanical workshop in the basement. And with those books and his own kind of physical capabilities, he built 3 telescopes, 2 refractors, and all 3 telescopes he built from scratch, including the mirrors and the lenses, which is significant in that time period for sure. 2 of them were reflectors of 6-inch aperture and 8-inch aperture. And then he built a little bit later, those were built in the very early in the 30s. And then a couple of years later, he built a refractor about 4-inch in aperture. So those 3 telescopes are the subject of the rest of this presentation. So just a little bit about his involvement in the London RASC Club. So he probably joined the club in around 1930. And we'll get to this part of the story a little bit later, but Peter Jedicke from that club was able to go through the resources that they had, and the records that they have are quite extensive, even back that far. And he was able to find a lot of the points that I'm going to make in the next couple of slides. So we know from those records that Donald and his wife Florence and their daughter Peggy attended many meetings in the 1931 to 51 period until Donald passed away. And I would argue that the fact that they brought their daughter Peggy to so many meetings is probably the reason that we still have the 3 telescopes today, and why one of them will be in the Dorner Museum. So we'll come to that in a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, he built the 2 reflectors in about 1930, 31, 32 timeframe. And then, so here's a clip from one of the minutes from November 11th, 1932, London Center meeting at the London Life Building. Mr. Henniger gave a most interesting account of his construction of 2 reflecting telescopes and the problems he encountered in grinding and polishing the mirrors. And both telescopes were displayed to the members. So we know that they were built by 1932. He served on the council in 1933. Here's another clip with the telescopes in action from September 14, 1934. And this one was at a dark sky site, the Higgins Farm. I assume that was a member's farm outside of London, likely. But after walking over the interesting grounds, members had supper over a campfire. And afterwards, 2 telescopes were set up under the direction of the president and Mr. Henniger so that the members could view Saturn and the double star Mizar. So that came from the minutes from that night. And a little bit later, February 8, 1935, we have another meeting at the London Life Building where Mr. Henniger brought in his recently built 4-inch refracting telescope. So that's how we have a sense that it was probably built a couple of years later, probably in late 1934 or so. But he was demonstrating that, or at least displaying that to club members in February of 1935. He served on their London Centre as BP from 36 to 38. He was also just on the General Council in 39, 43, and 46. So lots and lots of involvement with the London Centre, a key member of the club. And then here's just an example of one of the attendance lists. And I found this quite impressive that the London RASC Club had records like this. But this is an attendance list from a picnic back in June 8th of 1934. And here you can see the 3 Hennigers, Donald, Peggy, and Florence, were the first ones to sign the list. So lots of records like that in the London RASC Club materials. So he died in 51, as I mentioned, and that's a long time ago, right? That's 70 plus years ago. So how is it that we still have these telescopes? So let's just talk a little bit about the preservation period. So he died on June 29th, 1951, at a relatively young age. I think he was about 61 or so. But here's the obituary from the London Free Press, and I just highlighted a couple spots. Obviously, his London Life insurance company professionally as an architect there, but also that Mr. Henniger was one of the first members of the London Astronomical Society and was the owner of the largest privately owned telescope in London. And then that's probably not too hard to believe. At the time, probably the best telescope in London was the Hume Cronin Observatory on Western's campus, which has a 10-inch refractor. But that, of course, was not a private scope. That was a professional scope. And so it probably was quite rare for people to own telescopes of an 8-inch diameter back in those days. So that claim may well be true. Here's another piece of record from London RASC. This is written by the treasurer at the time, back on the 7th of July, 1951, and he's just informing members about the passing of Donald H. Henniger and refers to him as a worthy member of the club, and I think he very much was. Peter at one point researched as far to see where he was buried, and so he was buried in Woodland Cemetery in London, and that's a photo that Peter took on the right side. And on the left side, this just blew my mind. This is the thank you card from his wife Florence back to the RASC members, thanking them for all of their sympathies on the passing of Donald M. Henniger. And the club still has that card sent in 1951. That is record keeping. So what happened after that? Well, we have to advance now to about 1997, which is when I come into the story. So that's about 46 years between his passing and when the telescopes came into my possession. So his wife, Florence, passed away a few years later in 1954. And at that point, the telescopes were all passed on to their daughter, Peggy. That's the little girl that had been attending the London RASC meetings. By then, she had married a man named Mr. Bill Pollard. And so the Pollards didn't really use the scopes too much. I think Peggy obviously had exposure to astronomy by attending those RASC meetings, but appears not to have been a really active astronomer through most of her life. But they hung onto the telescopes in their basement for decades. And the night that I met Mr. Pollard to pick up the telescopes, he told me that the reason he never threw them out is because he knew that they had a lot of sentimental value to his wife, because she would remember her dad demonstrating these telescopes to the London RASC. So that's why I say I would argue that if they hadn't taken their little girl to those meetings, we might not have the telescopes today. So finally, when Peggy did pass away, though, Bill Pollard felt, okay, I think it's time now for me to do something with these telescopes, but I don't want to throw them out. So he contacted my father, Bob Ogwire, in 1997, because he knew that Bob had a son, me, who was interested in astronomy. So that's how I came into the picture. So now we'll get a little bit into the restoration, first of the 6-inch, and then we'll kind of trace the 8-inch all the way through to arriving for Randall to display in the Dorner Museum. So the first thing I did in 97, this is in the fall of 97, I took the 2 reflector telescopes that I got from Bill Pollard, and I took them to my family's cottage in Bayfield, Ontario. And I took, that's what they looked like at about the time that I got them. What I did that fall was just remove both primary mirrors. They were, of course, covered in silver. So, and they have very tight fitting galvanized lids to fit very tightly over those mirrors. And of course, the reason for that is trying to keep the air away from that silver as much as possible. But of course, we're talking about 50, 60 years since he had passed away. So I pried those galvanized metal covers off, and both mirrors were completely black with tarnish. So I kind of set the 8-inch aside. I took the 6-inch mirror back home. It looked to be in a little bit better shape. So I took it back home. I was living in Toronto at the time. I took it back home and I sent it away to Epstein Science, and they sent it away to somebody over the winter to have them recoat that 6-inch primary in aluminum, which of course won't tarnish moving forward. So that was done over the winter. And then I returned to the cottage in the summer of 1998 and put the mirror back in, collimated it. I did some painting and some cleaning up on the mount, repainted the optical tube assembly, polished the brass, etc., and got it functional. So that's a picture of me looking quite a bit younger in 1998 at the cottage with the restored 6-inch Henniger telescope. Now here's a slide. So this is first light of the 6-inch Henniger in probably what would have been about 50 years since anybody had seen any photons coming through that telescope. So that happened at that cottage in 1998, and shown here as a clip in the middle is a little clip from my Mickey Mouse logbook. But it's got all the data. It's got the date, and it shows that I was working with the 6-inch reflector at the cottage. It says that I looked at Jupiter, I looked at the Dumbbell Nebula, I looked at the M57 Ring Nebula, M8182 and Ursa Major, the Andromeda Galaxy, and M13. So those are all objects that I looked at on that first light night. But it also says that I took a couple of photos of the moon with the low magnification eyepiece and the high magnification eyepiece. And it says that I took them with the afocal method. And my writing's horrible, but it said what this says is tedious but great results. So let's take a look at those. So I was pretty pleased with these 2 shots back at the time. Remember, this is way before digital. So this is taken with an Olympus OM1 film camera and taken through the Henniger 6-inch telescope using the afocal method. And many of you will be aware of what that method is and why it's tedious. There is no way to attach that 35mm film camera to the Henniger telescope. So what you have to do is get the telescope lined up on the moon, but then you have to put the camera on a separate tripod of its own, and then try to position that lens of the camera as closely as you can to the eyepiece, and position it as well as you can, and then focus. And remember, the Olympus OM1 was the first single lens reflex camera in the world, so it was manual in every respect. So then you had to set everything to go. And of course, by then the moon's moved out of field because you don't have any tracking on the mount, right? So then you have to reposition the mount, reposition the camera, and try to get the shots away. But regardless, this was the one shot I took with the low power eyepiece. And then same night, this was taken with the medium power eyepiece. Turned out a little bit better. I think maybe the medium eyepiece might be a little bit better optical quality and obviously a little bit higher magnification. But I call this at the top here, it's the first and only photography with the 6-inch reflector. I don't know that for a fact, but I would imagine that amateur photography in the late 50s, which is the latest it could have been done through this telescope, was probably pretty rare. The telescopes existed, but I'm not sure that amateur cameras were good enough to do amateur astrophotography. The pros were taking pictures with glass plates, but I don't think a lot was happening at the amateur level. But I could be wrong. But I'm pretty sure that certainly there's no evidence that DM Henniger ever took photos through the telescope. So that's the 6-inch finished off there on the right side. So with that one completed, I started to think about, well, what am I going to do with this 8-inch? It's a big machine. I don't really need both. and maybe there's some other people that can benefit from some of this RASC heritage. So I contacted in '99. I contacted Peter Jedicke and sent him an email and said, "Hey, Peter, this is going to hit you completely out of the blue. You don't know me. You're hearing me from the first time, but I think I have two of the telescopes that used to be used in the very early days of your center. Are you interested?" And he, of course, jumped all over it. He was very enthusiastic. And my thanks to him. He's on the line tonight, by the way, but my thanks to him for doing the research that found a lot of those minutes and earlier clips that I had earlier in the presentation. So he did a great job researching that. And then in November 16, '99, I called Mr. Pollard back, who was still alive, and said, "Hey, I want to further donate the 8-inch telescope that you gave me to the RASC." And he thought that was a great idea and gave me his blessing on that. So on November 27th of '99, I went to the home of Peter Jedicke in London and presented the 8-inch Henniger telescope to the RASC club members. And I also brought the 6-inch that night, which of course was functional by that point. And so we set that up on the deck out back, and the members that were there that night took a look at Jupiter. So here's the group that night in Peter's garage with the 8-inch Henniger telescope, not functional at that point, a very black mirror, of course. Here's me looking quite a bit younger. There's Peter, and there's his wife Diane. But that was a really, really fun night, and we surprised the members with that piece of history. Peter, I think, kept them in the dark about what the meeting was all about that night at his place, and we had a lot of fun. So then the club kind of took over, starting to work on that 8-inch refractor or reflector. So Dave McCarter was London Center president for about 10 years. So he cleaned the mirror and put it on a Foucault tester. And this is technically more than I'm aware. I've never made telescopes myself, but he said it was a 20-centimeter plate glass, nearly f8, and it showed severe astigmatism, not well corrected, and it had a central depression and a slightly turned up edge. And he comments that a lot of those defects were quite common in handmade, homemade mirrors at the time, given the technology that was used to do that. And the turned up edge wasn't really critical because it was hidden by the ring mount. So he repolished the mirror and parabolized it to about 1/10 of a wave. And then the primary was then recoded in year 2000 by Moonworks. Now, when he took that mirror out, it's actually when I took it out back at the cottage way back in the day, I found that Mr. Henniger had used newspapers as padding behind that 8-inch primary. And that's another piece of evidence about when these telescopes were built. These are just a couple of little clips out of those newspapers. But you can see Babe Ruth was hitting home runs back in that day, and you could take your family to Springbank Park for 25 cents. So from dating on that newspaper, we also were able to confirm, around that 1930-31 timeframe for the telescopes to be built. So another guy in the London Club was involved with the restoration, Dave Rubenhagen. And he worked on the mount and the pedestal and got some of that stuff functional and working again, including a kind of a worm gear movement that's set up on the mount. So there you can see the telescope on its mount. And he concluded, it's really a pretty good example of 1930s amateur telescope making. The interesting thing here is this door right here that's opened up at the back of the primary. Now, the reason for that door was access to the primary. Because recall that what I said about you'd have to reach in through that door and pry off that galvanized metal cover that's on really, really tight, really, really airtight. You'd have to reach in through this door, pry that off, pull it out, and then flip the door shut, and you're good to go. And so that's what that was there for. So those two guys did a nice job on the 8-inch Henniger, and here it is on display at the 2001 annual general meeting of the RASC, which was hosted by the London RASC in June of 2001 at Fanshawe College. And so that gives you a pretty nice look. There's Dave McCarter on the left, one of the two guys that had worked on the scope, and a pretty nice shot of the assembled 8-inch Henniger telescope. So now we get right up to the current state where Mr. Dorner had made his donation, and Randall was starting to pull together the collection. And so, Peter and I talked about it and thought, well, that'd be pretty good. I mean, the London Club had the telescope. They didn't really have a place to store it. And we thought, you know, now the most people that would be able to see it and appreciate it, you know, the best place might be right in that Dorner telescope. So we were really pleased when Randall was willing to accept the scope into his collection. So I was going to talk a little bit about the club, but Randall did a great job on that. So we don't need to do that now. But here's a picture of the space down at the RASC headquarters. And so there's the collection of scopes that will eventually be displayed roughly in this part of the headquarters. So you can see there's a lot of material there, a lot of content there, and that's why Randall's looking for volunteers to help him set it up. And there's the latest edition 2 weeks ago when we were down there for the donation. And so you can see the 8-inch Henniger and the mount and eyepiece cases. This is the primary, which is at the moment outside the optical tube assembly. And you can see that really tight fitting galvanized lid. I pried it off. And so here's the mirror. And I think it's just reflecting the ceiling tiles, but it's in pretty good shape. And still pretty clear from the work that was done on it earlier. But that gives you a feel for what the primary looks like. And there's the donation. So this was on March 23rd, so just about 2 weeks ago. And we had 5 members come down from the London RASC. So Peter and Diane Jedicke were there. Mark Tovey was there. And then we had Norm McCall and Rick Saunders. And they brought the telescope down from London. And then I came in from Oakville to meet them for lunch and have this event, which was great fun. So another photo op for a group of people around this old telescope. So I'm going to just wrap up now a little bit with Henniger's legacy. So professionally, the London Life Building continues to be a well-known landmark in London. And so that's a piece of his professional legacy for sure. And in fact, it was the London Life archivist that provided the photo that I had right on the front cover of the presentation. And Mark Tovey, thank you. He's on the line tonight as well. He helped me get that from the archivist at London Life because the family that I am in contact with didn't have any photos of DM Henniger. So, but London Life came through and provided a pretty nice photo of him. But astronomically, Peter Jedicke did a nice thing a number of years back and honored Mr. Henniger by getting an asteroid named after him in the main asteroid belt. And so here we go. It's 14164 Henniger. And this came as a surprise to me. I didn't know Peter had done this. And I was researching this presentation and came across an asteroid named after Donald Henniger. And I thought, wow, I bet you even the family doesn't know that. And so here's the little description that Peter provided to them. Was an amateur telescope maker and active member of the Royal Astronomical Society in Canada, London Centre, served as VP and Centre, etc. And he was staff architect at London Life. So a nice description there. And there's a button you can press if you're at the IAU Minor Planet Center website. You can click on this button to see an approximation of the orbit of the asteroid. And so this is what comes up when you do that. And so there it is, right between Jupiter and Mars, which is right where we'd expect a main asteroid belt asteroid to be. And then you can also go over to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory link and you can learn a little bit more about the Henniger asteroid. And here we can see that it's got about a 5-year period. It's got an absolute magnitude of about 14th magnitude, diameter of about 4 kilometers, so pretty good sized, and a rotation of about 11 or 12 hours. So that's a cool piece of legacy for his astronomical interests. And then the last few slides, so where are the telescopes today? Well, the 6-inch Henniger that I restored is still on display in my man cave. It happens to be an unfinished basement, which is kind of tacky, but I have a spotlight on it so that it has a little bit of class at least. But it's, I like it. I'm going to have it as long as I live. It's a cool little piece. But I'm very happy that the larger telescope is going to make it into the Dorner Telescope Museum, and looking forward to at some point a photo of it being on display down in that museum, and that's great. And then lastly, let's not forget about the forgotten telescope. So whatever happened to the 4-inch Henniger refractor that he built in about 1935? So that one was never passed on to me, but we have chased it down. And here it is in the basement of one of his descendants in London, Ontario. And they are hoping to someday get that telescope functional as well. And so I've offered the help of the RASC Club in London if they need help to get that happening. But that telescope is still in existence, and another chapter waiting to be written. So that's my presentation. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions about the Henniker legacy.
Oh, that's great, Kirby. Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. Yeah, it was so cool how it all came to be. So I don't know if Peter or any of the London Center people have anything to add to that presentation. Never known Peter not to say something when he's been invited to say something, but maybe this is the first time.
Well, it won't be quite the first time, Randy, but Kirby's done a wonderful job of telling the story. I can confirm and corroborate any parts of Kirby's story that involved Diane and me, and it worked out really wonderfully. And I really thank Kirby for reaching out to us and making the effort in the first place. And thanks to Randall for welcoming the 20 centimeter reflector at the DTM.
Definitely. Yeah, it's great that we have places now where these artifacts can be displayed and the history captured as well. So, yeah, I had a similar experience when I was president of the Toronto Centre. There's a fellow named, his last name was Maybe, and he contacted me, and he lived in Oakville, and he asked me to visit him, and I'll turn my video on here. And he said he had a telescope that be nice to donate to the society. And it turned out that his dad was on the 1905 eclipse trip to Labrador, and on that trip was Clarence Augustus Chant and Dr. and Mrs. Mauder, and I think Plaskett was also on that expedition. And he had the telescope that his dad used. And so now I think that telescope is up at the Toronto Centre Observatory. So it's interesting how, these people come up with this, the descendants, have these telescopes that hopefully they will make available to us. Now that we have a museum and we can promote that, then it's a lot easier for them to donate something. So. Any other questions for Kirby before we close the meeting?
Sure. Kirby, that was fantastic. And, well, two things. I really thank you for preserving it and donating it. It's just, yeah, you don't have to, I think you and PJ both said you thanked me for accepting it. No. You don't have to thank me for accepting it. This is exactly the sort of thing that I hope to survive. And if someone actually offers me this sort of fantastic example of RASC technology from the past, I'd go out of my way to to get it from the museum. This is just fantastic. It's like one of these dream things because you just don't expect this stuff to survive. And I think you're right. If it wasn't for his daughter having been taken to those museums, there's a good chance it wouldn't live today. Now, your presentation was excellent. You did a hell of a lot of work. I would love to see that as an article in the journal. And clearly you can put stuff together and you can write. So it'd be great if you could do that. But I guess the other thing, if you don't mind, I'd love to have a copy of the presentation for the Dorner Telescope Museum, just for its files.
Yeah, absolutely. I left some hard copy documentation with the telescope when you do get into the office, but I will send you and Peter and Mark a link that will take you to a Dropbox folder where you can find all the original folders and you can find that presentation. I'm happy to do that, and I'm happy to write a journal article as well.
That would be great. And I guess another question. I was impressed. I mean, afocal was a real pain in the Barlow lens, as you say. And I was impressed by how sharp it was on the Terminator. I mean, that's not easy. But the other question I got to ask is, what's it like to use visually, the 6-inch?
Yeah, it's not bad. It works pretty well for the planets. It's probably a bit blurry, a bit of astigmatism around the edges, but it worked pretty well on the planets, and you could see that it gives a pretty good view on the moon. And anybody who's done astrophotography knows that usually things look better with the eye than they do with the camera, especially back in those days with the kind of technology we had for photography back then. So those photos probably don't do justice to what the moon looked like with a naked eye. It has no tracking, of course, so it's not the most user-friendly instrument to use. And I don't use it a lot because it's heavy to move. So I probably haven't had it in action for a couple of decades now. But it's a fun little instrument.
Yeah, this is cool. And with the eight, yeah, thanks for that. That interested me. So it's worthwhile. And of course, there's the experience of using this old thing, which has all the history behind it. The 8-inch that you donated, of course, there's at least 2 RASC stories there about amateur telescope makers, or 3 actually. So there's Henniger himself, he did the majority of work, but McCarter's there as well, which is really cool to have one of his mirrors in that instrument. So I've got Dave there, and then Normand Fulham, of course.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, those guys did a lot of work on restoring it, and so it's hats off to them to get it much more restored to what it was when I got it.
Was it Alan Ward or Normand who did the silvering?
I'm not sure. I think it was Moonbeam. I think my presentation.
Oh, so it was Alan
Yeah.
at Sudbury. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Anyways, fantastic.
Great, thanks. I think it was a great idea to put our 2 presentations together back to back like that, because it's a small piece of history that's going into an exciting museum that's coming soon.
Yes, thank you both, and thank you to all of our presenters tonight and everyone participating.
So
Mark
Randy,
has his hand up.
if I could just, I just thought it might be worth showing you all what the London Life Insurance Company building looks like, right? So if it's right that building 1 of the London Life Insurance Company building, which I'm assuming is showing up in your screen right now, yes? Kirby, is it showing up on the screen?
We get Walker exhaust products.
Get exhaust pipes. Okay, a friend of mine was asking about exhaust earlier. This always happens, so I'm going to just try it again. Desktop 2. Let's see if it works. Second time's the charm.
That's better.
That's
Okay, fantastic. So, building 1 of the London Life Insurance Company building. Henniger was no slouch when it came to building buildings either. And here you can see the auditorium. I took a panorama of the auditorium in the building, and you can see really his attention to details. Again, we don't know which components precisely he had direct control over, but back in the day, J.M. Moore would, their drawings would include all of the architectural detail within, so that wouldn't be left up to craftspeople. They would do drawings of each individual light fixture, each individual piece of imbrication, everything that you see would have also been part of J.M. Moore and presumably some of Henniger's handiwork. So really, really impressive. And a story that may remain to be told around this. Certainly, Coldgrove had a lot to do with the Dresden Meteorite, but I'm just kind of wondering, I think Henniger was already in town at that point. The Dresden Meteorite was purchased for Western University by the directors of the London Life Insurance Company. Of course, the Dresden Meteorite in '39 was the largest meteorite ever to be recovered in Canada. So it was a pretty big deal back in the day. And the London Life stumped up really what was a phenomenal amount of money for it at the time to buy it for the university. And so I'm just wondering, there must have been a London Life connection there, and maybe it was Henniger. And so, that's another interesting story to be told, especially because the Henniger family's connection to the president of London Life, the family connection there. So that's really pretty interesting. And so here is the Dresden Meteorite back in the day when it was first recovered with a watch for scale. And here's where it's at for many years in the lobby of the Cronin Observatory with that sign that I was just showing you there. So I just thought I would show you those things there because it may be, coming attractions as we put our heads together and get the collective brain trust on this one.
That's great. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah,
Thank you, Kirby. I thoroughly enjoyed the presentation.
You're right. I think you're right. He may well have been involved in those things, given his interest in astronomy and his position at London Life. So it's probably pretty high probability.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody. I think we're going to close things off now. Just a reminder to Mississauga Center members that 2 weeks tonight we have a speaker, Dr. Chris Impey, University of Arizona, and the topic is astrobiology, how strange life might be. Boy, if that isn't a straight line. I'll just let that go there. So thanks, and this meeting, the video should be up on the Mississauga Center website. So if you know of anyone who'd be interested, it'll be there probably by the end of the weekend. Thanks again, everyone. Take care. Stay safe.
Thanks, Randy.
Thanks, guys. Thanks to our visitors.
Thanks, Randy. Great presentations. Thanks, guys.
Well done. We appreciate it. Take care.